Hello and welcome. The Middle East Quartet is currently locked in talks in Berlin in an effort to get the stalled peace process moving again. But already there appear to be splits over how to deal with the new Palestinian unity government.
US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has reiterated that any government must recognize Israel and renounce violence. But Russia has called for an easing of pressure on the Hamas-led body. Well, our correspondent Barnaby Phillips is in Berlin and he joins us now live. Barnaby, always likely to be disagreements. What exactly is the nature of the problem?
Well, essentially, it appears that the United States may, to some extent, be isolated at this meeting. I'll start with the Americans. Condoleezza Rice was talking in the German Foreign Ministry, which is the building behind me, earlier this afternoon. And those of us who followed her trip to the Middle East over the weekend would not have been surprised by what she was saying at all. She was saying that she was going to reserve judgment on the new Palestinian government, effectively reserving judgment on the Mecca agreement, but emphasizing that point which the Americans and the Israelis feel so strongly, that any new Palestinian government must renounce violence and must accept Israel's right to exist. This is what Condoleezza Rice said a short time ago.
It's very difficult to imagine a circumstance in which you have a peace talks, but one party doesn't recognize the existence of the other or the right of the other to exist. It's very difficult to imagine that peace is going to be promoted if there is not a renunciation of violence, and so that's why the Quartet principles are what they are. We've said, all of us, that we will await the formation of the new government before making any decisions about what to do, because we don't want to make premature decisions.
Now, other members of the quartet are taking a slightly different tack. We heard from the new United Nations Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, earlier today, and he said that he was very encouraged by the Mecca agreement, and it was up to the international community to encourage the Palestinians to form their new government. I've also been talking to advisors close to Javier Solana. Of course, he's the EU foreign policy chief. He's also in the meeting behind me. And those advisors are telling me that as far as the Europeans are concerned, Mecca was a positive development, an opportunity, and they would prefer to see the bottle half full rather than half empty. And of course, Nick, you were also quoting the Russians. So it does seem that the Americans are out a little bit on their own at this particular meeting.
Barnaby, are the Europeans pushing for the resumption of international aid into Palestine?
No, they're not. And I think that's where perhaps the Palestinians may be a little bit disappointed, and where President Abbas, who of course is touring Europe as well at the moment, may find himself a little bit let down. The Europeans are saying, yes, Mecca is a good thing. Yes, it is an opportunity, as I said, but it is premature at this moment to talk about the full-scale resumption of international aid to the Palestinian government. For the time being, the Europeans would prefer those temporary mechanisms they've been using, whereby they're helping civil society, giving some humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. But even they, and definitely the Americans, feel that the time is not yet appropriate to be resuming full-scale aid to the Palestinian Authority.
All right, thanks, Barnaby. It's Barnaby Phillips in Berlin.
Well, as the international community considers how to move the peace process forward, much depends on the Middle East Quartet. John Terrett takes a closer look at the ability of its participants to reach their own consensus.
Launched in 2002, the Middle East Quartet aims to come up with a common approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and eventually a solution. It was the quartet which introduced the idea of a roadmap for Middle East peace, calling on the Palestinians to reform, Israel to help them do it, and an end to violence from both sides. So which countries make up the quartet, and why are they involved? The United States is represented by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. As America's chief diplomat, she supports Israel's view that Palestinian attacks must stop and the Hamas-led Palestinian government openly recognize Israel before any real progress can be made. The United Nations is represented by new Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He said in his opening address last January that he would inject new momentum into the search for peace and stability in the Middle East by rededicating efforts into the work of the quartet. The Russian Federation is represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The Russians are keen to be seen as major players on the world stage, And Mr. Lavrov promotes strong relations with Israel stretching back to the end of the Second World War. Israel has many Russian immigrants. Vladimir Putin recently became the first Russian leader to tour the Gulf states, talking up his country's involvement in the Middle East peace process. The European Union is represented by Foreign Policy Chief Javier Solana. The EU has always strongly supported the Palestinians with trade and aid, though since the Hamas-led government took control in the occupied territories last year, funding has been suspended. So, in Berlin on Wednesday, discussion has been dominated by Monday's fruitless Israeli-Palestinian summit and last month's formation of a national unity government, despite Hamas's refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist. The quartet still has its work cut out. John Terrett, Al Jazeera.
Britain plans to withdraw 1,600 troops from Iraq in the coming months. Further reductions to the 7,000-strong force are expected later in the year.
The phase-out signals a further shrinking of the so-called coalition of the willing and comes as Denmark also announces the withdrawal of its 470 troops. Al Jazeera's Nazanin Mashiri has our report.
British troops out on patrol in Basra, something they won't be doing for much longer. 4 years after taking the country to war, Tony Blair announced that hundreds of British soldiers will be coming home.
What all of this means is not that Basra is how we want it to be, but it does mean that the next chapter in Basra's history can be written by the Iraqis. I've discussed this with Prime Minister Maliki, and our proposals have his full support and indeed represent his wishes. Already we have handed over prime responsibility for security to the Iraqi authorities in Al-Matuna and Daikar. Now in Basra, over the coming months, we will transfer more of the responsibility directly to Iraqis.
At the time of the Iraq invasion, there were 40,000 troops in the country. That's been reduced to 7,100. In the coming months, the numbers will now be reduced to 5,500. Thousands of soldiers will relocate to a heavily fortified base outside the city, there to support the Iraqi forces as necessary. The control of the region will be in the hands of the Iraqis themselves, taking their orders direct from Iraqi headquarters in Baghdad.
You can't see Basra in the same light as you see Baghdad. There's more than a geographical separation. The security situations are very, very different. And when you're looking at Basra in an Iraqi context, it is ready for the troops to take over.
For skeptics, this is also a political decision by a Prime Minister conscious of a legacy he'll be leaving behind. Tony Blair will be leaving office later this year. By making this announcement, he'll be ensuring that the start of the withdrawal of British troops from Iraq will be part of his legacy and not that of his successor. But it's also a military move. The UK's top commanders have been telling the government for months their presence has been making the situation worse, not better. It's a message taken on board by countries like Denmark, which along with Lithuania is removing all ground troops from the country. The US reaction, this is a sign of success in Iraq. But Washington will be hoping there won't now be a domino effect of announcements from other parts of the coalition. Nazanin Mashiri, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, Al Jazeera's Iraq correspondent, Hoda Abdulhamid, says most Iraqis in Basra will be relieved to hear British troops are leaving.
Well, there's always a relief when foreign troops leave Iraq. I mean, this occupation has always been extremely unpopular among Iraqis. A lot of the problems that are happening here in Baghdad are blamed directly on the occupation. So any troop leaving, withdrawal, is a relief. Obviously, the situation in Basra is completely different than the situation in Baghdad. For one, the security situation in Basra is much better than the security situation here in Baghdad. One of their main problems in Basra is probably the border control and how to control that long, enormous, porous border they have with Iran. As we know, that the US military here and also some Iraqi officials are accusing the Iranians of smuggling a lot of weapons through that border, all sorts of support for the different kind of militias here. So that will be probably one of the most challenging missions for the Iraqi troops whenever they take over the security of that area. That is not happening anytime soon. There is no date set for that.
Meanwhile, the violence continues in Iraq. Police say at least 13 people have died following a car bomb at a police checkpoint near a market in Najaf. Police were searching the car when a suicide bomber detonated explosives in the Shia holy city. 3 civilians, including 2 women and 4 policemen, were killed.